Hey there! This video is going to be a full review of the Canon R7 in terms of shooting video. There are a lot of reviews out there on YouTube about how to use this camera for wildlife photography and sports photography, utilizing the extra reach of the APS-C sensor. But this is a very powerful little video camera, and right now selling for $1,500 packs a lot of punch and a lot of value. And I bought this camera about 2 months ago with my own money, so this wasn't sent to me by anyone. This video is not sponsored. I've been using this camera a lot, and I've been testing and experimenting with the camera and documenting all the little details and testing it in different ways and showing that in several videos. So if you haven't been following along on the channel, I'll leave a playlist down below with all those videos, and I'll be using the information from those tests and those videos to put this review together. So if you're interested in more detailed information about any one specific topic, there's probably a video about it, so go check that out. Now, as I said, this is a very powerful little video camera and produces a stunning image, and in a lot of ways can hold up to cameras like the R5, which is selling for $3,900. And one big advantage that the R7 has over cameras like the R5 and the R6 is there's no more 30-minute record limit. So first of all, let's get into the image quality, because for any camera, that's probably one of the most important things. This camera produces an incredible image, and because it has a higher megapixel sensor, it does a 7K to 4K oversample known as 4K fine in this camera, giving the image a lot of detail and sharpness, and the colors are just awesome. In terms of codecs, this shoots in 10-bit 422 in C-Log 3. C-Log 3 is not the highest dynamic range log curve that is offered by Canon, that's C-Log 2, but C-Log 3 is the best profile that you can find in cameras like the R5 and the R5C. This camera doesn't shoot RAW, but it does shoot in IPB. A lot of people were hoping it would shoot in all-I. We'll get onto that a little bit later. But having 10-bit 422 C-Log 3 in this camera is absolutely awesome. It gives you a ton of dynamic range and a lot of flexibility in terms of color grading. So in terms of dynamic range, I did a bunch of testing on this too. This camera really does hold up to the R5, and I think it pretty much is on par with the R5. I'd say you get about 12 or just over 12 stops of dynamic range in C-Log 3, and it's really easy to color grade the footage. I think it just does a fantastic job and really kind of blew my mind with how good the image was coming out of this camera. Now, in terms of low light, I know a lot of people have question marks about low light on an APS-C camera because most people think if I want good low light, I need to have a full frame. Nowadays, I think that's changing quite a bit, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is because this camera is oversampled, that makes the low light capabilities or high ISO performance better. It also has, careful noise reduction, and the image just looks good. I think it holds up really well to about 6400 ISO, and this is in C-Log 3, and you could even push the camera to 8000 or 10,000 if you really need to. The autofocus is also incredible in this camera, and I paired it up against the R5, and I think it was on par with the R5 or maybe slightly better. From what I heard, it pulls in the autofocus technology in the R3, which is a fantastic camera and well known for its autofocus. So filming yourself, not a problem. Filming people, other subjects, there's a lot of different focus tracking in there, which I didn't test all of those things, but what I noticed for just filming myself is it works really well. This camera also has IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. There's a few different options in this camera. One is the physical sensor stabilization, which most people call IBIS. There's also two levels of electronic stabilization that you can add on top of that. So here are a few tests I did with a few different lenses. One was with an EF lens, one's with an RF lens, and then one is with an RF lens with stabilization that I'm hand holding the camera. And I know that a lot of people were critical about cameras like the R5 and the R6 for having wobbles as you're walking and vlogging. So take a look at these examples. As you can see, I'm pretty happy with the IBIS in this camera. I think it works pretty well. It's really handy to have when you're hand holding a camera, either for filming yourself with a wide angle lens or just standing there holding it and trying to get a static frame. Now on to overheating and battery life. This camera does a great job with controlling overheating. You can get it to overheat, and I did, as I said, a whole separate video about all those tests. But when I ran it inside in my studio here in 4K fine, it ran 2 hours and 14 minutes, and the battery died, and it didn't overheat. I did get the camera to overheat in the full sun. It was like 85, 90 degrees, and I put it right out in the sun, ran it in 4K fine, and it was about an hour and 1 minute till it overheated. One thing is it's really nice that it has that little meter that shows you as it starts to warm up instead of just flashing red and turning off like on some other cameras, so I really did like that. So you can get the camera to overheat, but again, that stress test that I did was really not a situation I would do. I would never just leave the camera outside in full sun running for an hour nonstop. I think for most people, overheating is not going to be an issue with this camera, but it's good to sort of know what the limitations are. And as I said, it ran for 2 hours and 14 minutes on one battery, recording nonstop in 4K fine. So battery life is awesome on this camera, and overheating I don't think is going to be an issue for most people. As I said at the beginning, this video is not sponsored, but it is made possible from all of your support for hitting that subscribe button down below. That's right, most of you I know are not subscribed to this channel. And check out the affiliate links that are in the description, both if you're interested in picking up an R7 or looking to check out any of the gear that I use on a regular basis. There are links down below. They don't cost you anything extra. So I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit subscribe, check out the affiliate links. Thanks so much. Now let's get into talking about rolling shutter. And I don't usually include this in my tests and reviews because personally, I've never had a shot ruined by rolling shutter. It's nothing that really affects my work personally, but some people were asking about it. So testing this out, it does not do well, and I think that was kind of expected with this camera because of the high megapixel count and that 7K oversampled to 4K. It is slow in reading out, and you will get rolling shutter. So if that's something that you care about, this is not going to be your camera. Now let's get on talking about build quality and the physical characteristics of this camera. This camera feels like any modern Canon mirrorless camera. It has a nice big grip that's easy to hold. The material feels nice and in general is pretty ergonomic and easy to use. So I think there's really no surprise there, but let's go around the camera a little bit. So on the front here, we have a manual focus, autofocus switch with a customizable button in there. And this is interesting to see this on the camera. And I think one of the reasons is that the kit lens, the 18-150, does not have an AF/MF switch. So maybe we're gonna see more inexpensive lenses for this camera that don't have that switch on them. I'm not really sure. We'll get onto lenses in a little bit. So let's go around the camera. So on the top here, we have a mode dial and we have our on off, and the on is photo and the other one is for video. So it's really nice for me when I'm shooting video because I can just flip it all the way over or all the way off. And now a lot of people were asking me about the customizable mode C1, C2, C3. Yes, you can use those in photo and video because you can set it to C1 and then flip it to video, set it to C2, etc. A couple other things on the top here. We have a record button and a function button and the ISO button. So let's talk about the ISO button because one thing that bothers me about this camera is that there's only two control dials for doing exposure. So you have one on the top here, which I would use for shutter speed. You have one on the back here, which I have to aperture. And then there usually is a wheel around the pad here for ISO, but that doesn't exist on this camera. So what they did is they added a button for ISO, so you press that and then you can make your adjustments. It's not ideal, I don't love it, but for me personally, I don't change the ISO very much. I shoot often outside and I'm leaving it at the base ISO, which is 800 on this camera in C-Log 3. Onto the back, it has a really nice flip out screen. It's not quite as nice as the R5, but generally speaking, Canon screens are great. I much prefer them to the Sony screens. Flip screen, so you can film yourself, which is great, kind of what you'd expect. Not as many customizable buttons as I'd like on the back, and a lot of people did not like this design with the wheel around the joystick thing right here too. So, but that is part of the design. I found to not really care so much. I would probably prefer the one that's usually on the back, but it'll be fine. Onto the ports. So we have kind of the normal setup here. We have micro HDMI, which we need full-size HDMI, Canon. We have the USB port. We have headphones, a remote port, and then the mic jack. One thing I do want to say about the mic jack, which is great, is that when you do have a microphone plugged in this, the screen does not interfere with it. So that's a really nice thing to have on this camera. Onto the other side, memory cards. We have two SD card slots, which is great that we only need SD cards. It's also great that we can dual record or relay record, those sorts of things. These are my favorite kinds of cards. I'll leave a link down below. I love these ProGrade V90 cards because they're really fast and they work in every camera that I have. So those are kind of my default. Onto the bottom is really just talking about the battery, which I mentioned before is the LPE6NH, which is a super common battery that you find in all the other Canon cameras. Great battery life. Overall, build quality, physical features, love it. Feels great in your hands, kind of everything you need, and really no complaints about that. As I've been talking about, this camera has great video capabilities, but my question really is, where does this fit into the Canon ecosystem in terms of video? As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is really similar to the R5 in a lot of ways for less than half the cost. It's similar in terms of the dynamic range, the image quality, and the low light. And I did a video comparing the R5 and the R7, and frankly, at 24 frames a second in 4K, they look almost identical. Of course, you're gonna get different depth of field capabilities and lens options and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the video capabilities, they're very, very similar. Also, where does this fit in as a B cam? So I've made videos comparing this with the R5C and the C70, and I think it can be an awesome B cam for both the R5C, the C70, and the R5, and almost interchangeable with the R5. So if a lot of people are thinking about picking this camera up to be an additional camera to some of the other cameras, I think it's a great bet, especially if you're thinking about the C70, which doesn't take photos. You can have a nice hybrid camera in your bag. Now let's go on to some of the things I don't like about this camera. First of all, let's talk about lenses, because this is something I've really been struggling with and having trouble recommending lenses for people. And I've done a lot of testing and experimenting, and I don't think there's a lot of great options. So other than the C70, which is a Super 35 sensor, this is the first RF mount Canon camera that has an APS-C sensor, and there really aren't a lot of lens options that are native to this. So as of right now, there are two RFS lenses, those are the crop sensor RF lenses. One is the 18-150. This is the kit lens for the R7. I will make a review about this. And then the 18-45, which is the kit lens for the R10. So you can use RF mount lenses on the R7, and I've been using my RF lenses a lot because they're awesome, but this RF 15-35 is a $2,400 lens, which is a little overkill for this camera, but I already had it, so I've been using my big expensive RF-L series lenses quite a bit. In terms of native lenses, I think a lot of people are going to be using their sort of inexpensive prime lenses. So this is like the 16 2.8. There's a 24 1.8 coming out. There's a 35 1.8, a 50 1.8, an 85 f2. I think those are going to be a lot of good options for this camera. But in terms of native glass, there really aren't a lot of options, and I'm not sure there will be. There are some rumors coming out. I don't really know if those are true or what's going to happen. Now, going back in the past, looking at sort of the crop sensors for the EF line, they didn't have the same level of quality as the full frame lenses. You couldn't get like an L series crop sensor lens. Of course, you can use full frame lenses, but they're more expensive, and you're not really using the full capabilities of it. So one great example is the Sigma 18-35. That's a fantastic lens. I made a video with that on the R7. I think that's a great option. Also using all the EF lenses with a basic adapter. So adapters are going to be your friend most likely on the R7. So there's a few. One is the basic $100 Canon EF to RF adapter. You can use any EF or EFS lens on this camera. So if you're upgrading from something like the 7D Mark II or any of the like 90D or those kinds of cameras, you can use all your old lenses on this camera, EF or EFS. Another great one is this Mica variable ND adapter. So this is an EF to RF adapter with a built-in variable ND filter. I love this filter adapter combo. I made a video about this. And then lastly is the speed booster. This is the Viltrox speed booster. Made a video about this too. You can use full frame EF lenses and get a wider field of view on your R7. So I think frankly, if you want to use full frame EF lenses, I'd probably get a combination of the Mica variable ND filter with the Viltrox adapter. And then if you're outside, it's really bright, use the variable ND adapter. If you're inside or it's really dark, use the Viltrox speed booster, you get an extra stop of light and a wider field of view. So there's a lot of different options out there, but frankly, I think one of the biggest struggles with the R7 is getting a good wide angle lens that's high quality. There isn't one out right now in terms of an RF lens. In terms of EF lenses, the only one I can really think of is the EFS 10-18 or maybe the Tokina 11-20. But there really isn't a great wide option for this camera, which is really frustrating because I think this could be a great camera, especially for vlogging and doing real estate and stuff like that. So if you need a really wide angle lens, you're probably thinking about using a speed booster or one of those lenses that I mentioned. Now let's go talk about more things I don't like about this camera and some limitations. Some things are unique to the R7, some are with all Canon mirrorless cameras. First of all, I mentioned this already in the physical characteristics section, is not having that third control dial is kind of a bummer for both photo and video. Again, there is a workaround with the ISO button. Not having all eye, I think, is going to be something that people are going to miss in this camera, and it's kind of a limitation. I think they could have put it in here, but they didn't. Personally, I shoot in IPV most of the time on most of my cameras because I don't do a lot of fast-moving subjects and things like that, so IPV is fine. And the bitrate is great. You get 170 megabits per second in 4K Fine 24. Let's talk about 4K 60, and I think this bothers a lot of people. So there are two modes in 4K 60. There is a line-skipped 4K 60, which is the full sensor readout, and you don't get that oversample and you get a loss of quality. Or there's a crop mode for 4K 60, which punches in an additional, I think, 1.81 times on top of the 1.6. So you multiply those two numbers together to get your actual crop. That is, I believe, a 1-to-1 readout, and you won't get that line skip thing. But again, you're cropping in a huge amount on the sensor, and you're going to get a much smaller field of view. So you have to consider that with your lens options. Micro HDMI, which I said before, is a real bummer in terms of video, but again, this camera is not really advertised as a video camera. Now I want to talk about some of the things that are frustrating with not just the R7, but Canon mirrorless cameras in general. First of all is the histogram. I use histogram for judging exposure, but as soon as you press record on the camera, the histogram disappears. I have no idea why this happens. It's really frustrating, especially when you're filming outside and the light changes and you have no idea what your exposure is. They need to fix that. It's on there. It's a great tool. Of course, I'd rather have things like false color and waveform. We're not going to get that in this camera, but it goes away while you're recording. Kind of crazy. HDMI out has some funkiness to it as well. There's two settings. One is you can get a clean HDMI out, which you can use for streaming or external recording. And you can see what you're doing on the camera on the back of the screen. It'll show you all your settings and exposure and stuff, but you can't record internally while you're doing that. And then the other option is you can, send a clean HDMI out by turning all the display features off on the camera, but then you can't see what you're doing, but you can record internally. So those are just weird options, and I don't know why that's set up that way. Custom white balance is antiquated. It's the old system that's in this camera, so you have to take a photo and then import that photo, and it should just have that one-touch custom white balance feature that you see in the Canon Cinema cameras and all the Sony cameras. It would make our life a lot easier. Let's talk about time lapses. So again, this is weird. You can't shoot time lapses in log, so you have to turn log off and then you can shoot your time lapse. And it defaults to outputting in 30 frames a second, so you cannot change that. So if you're putting in a 24 frames per second timeline, you're gonna have to adjust the speed to make it work. And there is a high frame rate option to get 120 frames per second in 1080p. You don't get any audio, and it always outputs in 30 frames a second. There's no way to change that. So if you're working a 24 frame per second timeline like I do, you have to slow it down to 80%. Again, just some weird stuff going on this camera in terms of video. Now let's talk about value, the competition, who this camera's for, and all those kinds of things. I think for $1,500, this camera packs an incredible value in terms of the image quality and some of the features that are in this camera. Great autofocus, dynamic range, low light capabilities, of course the image with the 4K fine, that 7K oversampled, 10-bit 422 C-Log 3 image, absolutely incredible. In terms of in the Canon world, as I mentioned, this does a lot of what the R5 can do, so I think for a lot of people this might be a better bet. You can get two of these for less than the price of an R5. Now onto the R6, and I've been getting a lot of questions about the R6 versus the R7. I've never personally used the R6, but from everyone that I know that has, and from watching reviews online, I know the R6 has a strong tendency to overheat in 4K. Now, if you're doing mostly photography and short bursts of video and you want a full frame sensor for photography, you want a full frame readout for 4K 60, I think the R6 can be a great option. But if you're doing mostly videography, I would recommend the R7 for the fact that the overheating is much more controlled and you don't have a 30-minute record limit, and it's also $1,000 cheaper. Talk about the R10 for a second. Now, I haven't used or reviewed the R10, and I just want to mention it because it is another Canon camera that's, sort of comparable, but I think if you're going to talk about video, I would skip the R10 because it doesn't shoot in log, and I think really, if you're going to be doing this for video, you really want to have a log option. And really, the only way to get 10-bit video is to use the HDR PQ mode in the R10. So again, if you're doing video, I'd probably recommend paying a little bit extra for the R7. Now, in terms of Sony, I don't think they have a competitor for this. You have on one hand the ZVE10, which is an 8-bit APS-C camera, and then you have like the A7 IV, which is a full-frame $2,500 camera that does basically what this thing does, but in full frame, and it's more expensive. So I don't think there's a direct competitor right now. I do hope that Sony is coming out with a 10-bit APS-C camera soon. They're well overdue for it, and they come out with a bunch of lenses. There are a couple options from Fuji as well. There's the X-T4 and the XH2S. I think they're kind of just different kinds of cameras. And for me personally, I've owned the X-T4 for a little while, and I found that, the autofocus does work a little bit better on the R7, and it's just a personal preference thing in terms of lenses and which ecosystem you're in. The XH2S, which did recently come out, looks like it has better autofocus. I haven't personally used it, but it is also a $2,500 camera. So I think in terms of the, competition here, if you're looking for a 10-bit video camera that can shoot in log with decent autofocus for this price, I think it's a great camera. Who's this camera for? I think it fits the bill for a lot of people. I think it fits the bill for people wanting to maybe upgrade from the DSLR world and get into their first mirrorless camera. Great camera for that. Again, you can adapt your old lenses. I think it's great for people getting into YouTube for shooting vlogs and stuff like that for the price point. As I said, great option. One thing you can do is if you think you're going to be upgrading to future cameras, you could buy full frame lenses, and then when you upgrade to a full frame camera from Canon, then you already have those lenses. I also think it's a great camera to add in your bag as a B or C camera for cameras, as I mentioned before, like the C70, the R5C, and the R5. Overall, I highly recommend this camera for shooting video. There's a few limitations, but I think for most people in most situations, it's going to find a really nice home in their bag. There will be a video I'll be making soon coming up about how to rig out this camera for shooting video in a more professional situation and battery solutions and all that kind of stuff, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.